Stranded in the void. The barren planet stretched endlessly under a crimson sky, its cracked surface glowing faintly from the heat of nearby volcanic vents. The air shimmered with heat, and the only sound was the distant rumble of lava flows. This was not a place for life, yet life clung to the edge of survival. Lyra lay motionless among the jagged rocks, her pale skin a stark contrast against the scorched ground. Her dark, tattered cloak barely covered her small frame. Deep gashes on her arms and legs oozed a strange, silvery liquid, her blood. Her breaths were shallow, her chest rising and falling as if every breath cost her more than she could afford. Her violet eyes, faintly glowing, stared blankly at the sky above. She had been left here to die. Her own people, the Zalarans, had cast her out. They feared what she could become. Lyra wasn't just any Zalaran. She was a hybrid, born with abilities no one could explain and no one dared to accept. When her powers had begun to manifest, her people had turned on her, labeling her a threat. The ambush had come without warning. Her ship was destroyed, her crew betrayed her, and now she was here, alone on this forsaken planet. But Lyra wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She clenched her fists, her sharp nails digging into her palms. Her body screamed for rest, for nourishment. The hunger gnawed at her insides, a sharp and relentless pain. Her kind fed on energy, not food, and her reserves were dangerously low. The silvery blood she was losing wasn't just her life force, it was her power. If she didn't find a way to recover soon, she would fade into nothingness. A sudden noise broke the silence. A distant rumble echoed across the barren wasteland. Lyra's sharp senses caught it immediately. She forced herself to turn her head, her glowing eyes scanning the horizon. At first, there was nothing. Then, a streak of light shot through the sky. A ship. It hurtled downward, trailing smoke and fire, and crashed with a deafening roar just a few miles away. Her heart skipped a beat. A ship meant life. Someone could be aboard. Someone who could help. But it also meant danger. If the Zalarans had sent someone to finish her off, she wouldn't stand a chance in her weakened state. Still, she had no choice. If she stayed here, she would die. If she moved toward the crash, there was a sliver of hope. Slowly, painfully, Lyra pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled under her weight, and she leaned against a jagged rock for support. The crash site was far, but she could see the smoke rising in the distance. Every step she took felt like an eternity, the hunger and pain dragging her down. But she kept moving. She had to. As she neared the crash site, the wreckage came into view. The ship was small, likely a single pilot craft, and it was half buried in the ground. Smoke billowed from its broken engines, and sparks flew from exposed wires. Lyra stopped a safe distance away, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. A figure emerged from the wreckage. It was a man, a human, judging by his stature and the bulky suit he wore. He stumbled out of the ship, coughing and waving away the smoke. His helmet was cracked, and his face was partially visible, a rugged man with tired eyes. He clutched a small device in his hand, frantically pressing buttons as if trying to call for help. Lyra's heart raced. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy. Most avoided Zalaran-controlled space, and for good reason. But this man was clearly alone. His ship was damaged, and from the looks of it, he was just as stranded as she was. She stepped forward, but her weakened legs betrayed her. She fell to her knees with a soft thud, and the man's head snapped in her direction. His eyes widened as he spotted her. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Lyra's glowing eyes met his, and she saw the fear flicker across his face. "Help me," she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, his hand hovering over the holster at his side. He was armed, but he didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he took a cautious step toward her, his expression a mix of fear and curiosity. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice steady but unsure. Lyra nodded weakly. She didn't have the strength to explain, and even if she did, she doubted he would understand. Her kind had a reputation for being ruthless predators. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't sure if he should trust her. I don't know what you are," he said, glancing nervously at her fangs. "But if you need help, I'll try." He reached out a hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra felt a spark of hope. She took his hand, her cold fingers gripping his tightly. The human flinched at her touch but didn't pull away. As he helped her to her feet, Lyra felt her strength fading fast. The last thing she saw before darkness overtook her was the human's concerned face and the faint glow of her own blood staining the ground. The unlikely savior. Jack winced as he pried open the last of the control panels inside his wrecked spacecraft. Sparks flew, and the acrid smell of burning circuits filled the air. He muttered under his breath, slapping the side of the console. Great, just perfect. His emergency beacon was fried, the ship's engines were toast, and the heat outside was enough to cook him alive if he stayed out too long. It had been a routine solo cargo run. Jack had been hauling spare parts across the sector when an uncharted asteroid field had thrown his ship off course. The last thing he remembered was alarms blaring and the sickening jolt of the crash. Now he was stranded on a barren alien planet, with nothing but his tools and his stubborn determination to survive. He leaned against the edge of the ship, scanning the horizon. The landscape was nothing but a wasteland of jagged rocks and glowing lava streams. The atmosphere was breathable, barely, but the oppressive heat pressed down on him like a weight. If he didn't figure something out soon, he wouldn't last long. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a mirage. A figure, hunched and shrouded in a tattered cloak, was stumbling toward the wreckage. Jack instinctively reached for the blaster at his side. "What the hell?" he muttered. His eyes narrowed as he focused on the approaching figure. It was definitely humanoid, but something was off. The glow of her eyes, violet and faintly flickering, sent a chill down his spine despite the heat. She collapsed a few feet from the ship, her body hitting the ground with a soft thud. Jack's instincts screamed at him to stay back, to avoid getting involved, but the faint rasp of her voice stopped him cold. "Help me." He hesitated. His fingers tightened around the grip of his blaster as he took a cautious step closer. Her cloak had fallen away, revealing more of her alien features. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and streaked with silvery blood. Her face was sharp and delicate, framed by dark, matted hair, but it was her fangs that stood out the most, faintly visible even as she struggled to breathe. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard stories about creatures like her. The Zalarans were notorious across the galaxy, cold, dangerous, and impossible to trust. Yet this one was clearly dying. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembling as they clawed weakly at the ground. He lowered his blaster. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But he couldn't just leave her there. Whatever she was, she needed help. And if she turned out to be a threat, well, he'd deal with that later. "Stay still," he said, kneeling beside her. She flinched at his approach, her glowing eyes darting to his face. He raised his hands, showing her he meant no harm. "I'm not gonna hurt you. Just don't bite me, okay?" Her lips twitched in what might have been a weak attempt at a smile. Or maybe it was just the pain. Jack couldn't tell. Carefully, he slipped an arm under her shoulders, lifting her as gently as he could. She was lighter than he expected, almost too light, as if her body was barely holding itself together. The moment her weight shifted onto him, he felt a sudden jolt of unease. Her skin was ice cold, and there was something about the way her eyes flickered that made him feel like he was holding a storm barely contained. Still, he carried her into the ship, setting her down on a makeshift cot in the corner of the cabin. Jack rummaged through his supplies, pulling out a med kit and a small container of synthetic blood. He used the blood for repairs on certain alien tech, but maybe it would help her too. He wasn't sure. "I don't even know if you can drink this stuff," he said, holding the vial up to her. "But it's the closest thing I've got." Her eyes widened slightly as she saw the vial. Without a word, she reached for it, her fingers trembling. Jack handed it to her, watching as she drank it in one desperate gulp. The effect was immediate. The color returned to her pale skin, and her breathing steadied. Her glowing eyes brightened, locking onto his with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step back. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice stronger now, but still laced with exhaustion. Jack crossed his arms, trying to mask his unease. "You're welcome. Now mind telling me what the hell you are and how you ended up here?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I was left behind," she said finally. "My people, they didn't want me anymore." Jack frowned. "Didn't want you? What does that mean?" "It doesn't matter." Her voice was bitter, but there was a hint of sadness, too. She looked up at him, her glowing eyes filled with something he didn't expect. "Fear. They'll come for me. They'll kill me. And if you help me, they'll kill you too." Jack snorted. "Yeah, well, I'm already stuck on a dying rock in the middle of nowhere. Doesn't seem like things can get much worse." "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "They won't stop until I'm dead. And now they'll hunt you too." Jack stared at her for a long moment. He had 100 questions, but before he could ask any of them, his ship's proximity alarm blared. He turned to the console, his stomach sinking as he saw the display. An unidentified fleet was heading straight for them. Trust on thin ice. The small cabin of Jack's ship was dimly lit, the faint hum of failing systems, the only sound breaking the silence. Lyra sat on the edge of the makeshift cot, her glowing eyes fixed on the floor. Jack stood at the console, his back to her, fingers tapping furiously as he tried to decipher the proximity alarm. "This is bad," he muttered. "Real bad." Lyra's gaze flickered to the screen. The alien fleet's approach was unmistakable. The symbols on the display confirmed what she already knew. Her people had found her. A mixture of fear and bitterness welled up inside her. They hadn't even given her the chance to disappear quietly. They wanted her eliminated, and they would destroy anyone who stood in their way. "You should let them take me," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the hum of the console. Jack spun around, his brows furrowed. "Are you serious? They're coming here with enough firepower to turn this whole planet into dust, and you think surrendering will stop them?" "It will stop them from killing you," she replied, meeting his gaze. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in her hands as she clenched them in her lap. "They won't care about you if I'm gone." Jack let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, sure. Let's trust the bloodthirsty alien armada to play nice after they've got what they want. Sounds like a solid plan." Lyra winced at his sarcasm, but didn't argue. She knew he was right. Her people wouldn't stop until every trace of her existence was wiped out. Still, she couldn't shake the guilt weighing on her. Jack had no reason to help her, yet here he was, risking everything for a stranger. A monster, no less. "Look," Jack said, leaning against the console. "I don't know what you did to piss off your people, but I'm not about to hand you over just because they say so. That's not how I operate." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "You don't even know me. Why would you risk your life for someone you've just met?" Jack shrugged, the corner of his mouth twitching into a faint smirk. "Call it a bad habit. I've got this annoying tendency to help people who need it, even if they've got fangs." Her lips quirked into the faintest of smiles, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You don't understand what they're capable of. If they find us." "They won't," Jack interrupted, turning back to the console. "Not if I can help it." He began typing commands into the system, his mind racing. The ship was barely functional, and the heat from the planet's surface was pushing its systems to the brink. They couldn't stay here, but escaping the atmosphere with a damaged ship was a death sentence. He needed a plan, and he needed one fast. Behind him, Lyra shifted uncomfortably. "There's something I can do," she said hesitantly, "but you won't like it." Jack glanced over his shoulder. Oh, this should be good. Let's hear it. Lara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the cot. I can mask our presence, cloak the ship, but it'll drain what little energy I have left. And if they scan too deeply, they might sense me anyway. Jack stared at her, his mind grappling with the implications. Cloak the ship? How? Is this some kind of Zalaran tech? It's not technology, Lara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It's me, my abilities. Jack's eyes widened. You're telling me you can cloak an entire ship with what? Your mind. It's more complicated than that, she said, her tone defensive. But yes, I can shield us. For a while. Jack let out a low whistle, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, that's convenient and a little terrifying. What's the catch? The catch, Lara said, her voice sharp, is that if I do this and they still find us, I won't have the strength to fight. You'll be on your own. Jack studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. All right. Do it. Lara blinked, caught off guard by his quick agreement. Just like that. You're not even going to question it. I don't have time to question it, Jack said, gesturing to the proximity alarm. Unless you've got a better idea, I'm all ears. But right now, it's cloak the ship or get blown to pieces. So yeah, just like that. Lara sighed, standing unsteadily. Her legs still felt weak, but she pushed the discomfort aside. Closing her eyes, she took a deep breath, focusing on the energy coursing through her. It was faint, barely a spark, but it was enough. She extended her hands, her fingers trembling as a faint glow surrounded her. Jack watched in awe as the light spread, washing over the ship like a shimmering veil. The console's alarm fell silent, and the display showed the alien fleet continuing its search without stopping. Holy hell, Jack muttered. It worked. Lara opened her eyes, her body sagging with exhaustion. Don't celebrate yet. It won't last long. You need to get us out of here. Jack nodded, sliding into the pilot's seat. Hang on. This is gonna be rough. The ship's engines roared to life, sputtering and sparking as Jack pushed them to their limit. The vessel shook violently as it lifted off the ground, the heat from the planet's surface pushing against them. Lara clung to the edge of the cot, her vision blurring as the strain of maintaining the cloak took its toll. As they broke through the atmosphere, the alien fleet's ships loomed on the display, their shadows massive against the blackness of space. Jack gritted his teeth, steering the ship into a nearby asteroid field. Let's see how good these guys are at playing hide and seek. The ship weaved through the asteroids, the hull groaning under the pressure. Lara's glow flickered, her energy waning. Jack glanced back at her, worry etched across his face. Just hold on a little longer, he said. We're almost clear. But Lara knew her limits. The cloak wouldn't hold much longer, and the fleet was closing in. I hope you have a plan, human, she murmured, her voice weak. Jack smirked, his eyes locked on the controls. Oh, I've got a plan. It's terrible, but it's a plan. The hunter becomes the hunted. The asteroid field was a labyrinth of jagged rocks, each one spinning and tumbling in chaotic orbits. Jack's battered ship wove through the narrow passages, its hull groaning under the strain of sudden maneuvers. Every so often, an asteroid scraped against the ship, sending shudders through the cabin. You call this a plan? Lara asked, her voice weak but laced with sarcasm. She was slumped in her seat, her skin pale, the glow in her eyes dim. The strain of cloaking the ship had taken a visible toll. It's a great plan, Jack shot back, his hands gripping the controls. Stay in the asteroid field, lose the bad guys, don't die. Simple. Simple. Lara let out a weak laugh. You're flying a ship that's barely holding itself together, through an asteroid field, while being hunted by a fleet that will kill us if they find us. And you call this simple? Jack grinned despite the situation. Hey, I didn't say it was easy. The proximity alarm blared again, cutting off their banter. Jack's grin vanished as he glanced at the screen. One of the alien ships had entered the field, its sleek design gliding effortlessly through the chaos. It was a scout, smaller and faster than the rest of the fleet, a perfect hunter. "They're adapting," Lyra said, her voice tight. "They're sending scouts to flush us out." "Yeah, I noticed," Jack muttered. He slammed the throttle forward, pushing the engines to their limit. The ship groaned in protest, warning lights flashing across the console. "Hold on to something." Lyra gripped the edge of her seat as Jack banked hard to the left, narrowly avoiding a spinning boulder. The scout ship followed, its movements smooth and precise. Jack cursed under his breath. The Zolarans had always been known for their superior technology, and now he was seeing it firsthand. "They'll catch us," Lyra said, her voice calm but grim. "Their ships are faster, more agile. You can't outrun them." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Jack replied. "Any other helpful observations? Maybe a shortcut through this mess?" Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes narrowing as she studied the scout ship's movements on the screen. "Not a shortcut," she said slowly, "but there's something I can do." Jack glanced at her. "I'm listening." Lyra closed her eyes, focusing what little energy she had left. "Their ships rely on advanced sensors to navigate. If I can disrupt their systems, even for a moment, we might have a chance to lose them." "Disrupt their systems? How?" Jack asked, his tone skeptical. Lyra opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "You've seen what I can do. I can manipulate energy fields. If I can focus my power, I might be able to overload their sensors." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Might. It's not a guarantee," she admitted. "And it'll drain me completely. But it's our best shot." Jack frowned, his mind racing. He didn't like the idea of her pushing herself to the brink, but the alternative was a guaranteed death sentence. "All right," he said. "Do it." Lyra nodded, her expression determined despite her exhaustion. She unbuckled herself and stood unsteadily, making her way to the center of the cabin. She knelt on the floor, her hands resting on the cold metal. Closing her eyes, she took a deep breath, centering herself. Jack watched as a faint glow began to emanate from her body, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The air in the cabin grew charged, a tingling sensation prickling his skin. The ship's lights flickered as Lyra's energy built, the glow intensifying. Outside, the scout ship was closing in, its weapon systems locking onto Jack's ship. But before it could fire, a pulse of energy erupted from Lyra, invisible to the naked eye, but powerful enough to scramble the scout ship's sensors. The alien vessel veered off course, its sleek movements turning erratic as it collided with a nearby asteroid, exploding in a bright flash. Jack let out a whoop of triumph. "Nice work, Lyra. You just saved our—" He stopped mid-sentence as he turned to her. Lyra had collapsed, her body limp on the floor, the glow in her eyes completely gone. Panic surged through him as he rushed to her side, checking for a pulse. Her skin was cold, but faintly, he could feel the steady thrum of her heart. "Come on, Lyra," he muttered, lifting her back onto the cot. "Don't quit on me now." The ship's alarms blared again, snapping him back to reality. The rest of the fleet was closing in, their ships skimming the edge of the asteroid field. Jack cursed, his hands flying across the controls. The asteroid field had bought them time, but it wouldn't be enough. They needed a way out. His eyes scanned the navigation screen, searching for options. A faint blip caught his attention. A hidden cavern on one of the larger asteroids, just big enough to fit the ship. It was risky, but it might be their only chance to hide and make repairs. Jack gritted his teeth, steering the ship toward the cavern. The vessel shuddered as it scraped against the narrow entrance, but they made it inside. The cavern was dark and eerily quiet, the walls glistening with crystalline formations that refracted the ship's dim lights. He powered down the engines, plunging the cabin into silence. For the moment, they were safe. Jack sank into the pilot's seat, running a hand through his hair. He glanced at Lyra, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "You're one hell of a fighter," he said softly. As he leaned back, his mind raced with questions. Who was this girl, really? What were her people so afraid of? And more importantly, how was he going to keep them both alive when the entire galaxy seemed to be hunting her? Betrayal in orbit. The cavern was dark, save for the faint glow of the crystalline formations dotting the walls. Jack paced near the ship's console, glancing back every so often at Lyra. She lay motionless on the cot, her pale skin almost blending with the dim light. Her breaths were shallow but steady, and for now, that was enough to keep his panic at bay. Jack rubbed the back of his neck, muttering to himself, "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" The ship's scanners were on low power to avoid detection, but the display still showed the alien fleet hovering nearby. They were systematically scanning the asteroid field, their massive vessels looming like predators waiting for prey to slip up. Jack leaned over the console, his jaw tightening. They weren't going to give up. "Stubborn bastards," he muttered. Behind him, a soft groan broke the silence. Jack turned sharply to see Lyra stirring, her fingers twitching as she slowly opened her glowing violet eyes. She blinked, disoriented, before her gaze settled on Jack. "You're still alive," she said weakly, her voice hoarse. "Yeah. Well, you're not getting rid of me that easily," Jack replied, his tone light, but his expression serious. "You, on the other hand, scared the hell out of me. What were you thinking, pulling a stunt like that? It worked, didn't it?" She countered, trying to sit up but wincing as her body protested. "Barely," Jack said, stepping closer. He handed her a small container of water, which she accepted with trembling hands. "You need to stop pushing yourself like that. You're not invincible." Lyra gave a bitter laugh. "I'm not much of anything right now." Jack sighed, sitting down across from her. "Look, I don't know what kind of mess you were in before you landed here, but you're not alone anymore. If we're gonna survive this, we need to work together. No more solo heroics, got it?" Her eyes softened, and she nodded reluctantly. "Got it." Before either of them could say more, the ship's console emitted a sharp beep. Jack rushed over, his stomach sinking as he read the display. A small craft had detached from one of the alien motherships and was heading straight for their hiding spot. "They found us," Jack said grimly. Lyra stood, swaying slightly but steadying herself against the wall. "We need to leave. Now." "No kidding," Jack replied, already powering up the ship. The engines hummed to life, and the cavern filled with the low rumble of machinery. The small craft was closing in fast, its sleek design unmistakable. It was a Zalaran hunter ship, designed for precision strikes and capturing high-value targets. As Jack maneuvered the ship out of the cavern, the hunter craft opened fire. Bright energy bolts streaked through the asteroid field, narrowly missing Jack's vessel. The ship shook violently as a near miss rattled its shields. "Can you do that cloaking thing again?" Jack yelled over the noise. Lyra shook her head. "Not yet. I need more time to recover." "Figures," Jack muttered, gripping the controls tightly. "Guess we'll have to do this the old-fashioned way." The asteroid field became a deadly maze as Jack piloted the ship through narrow gaps and around spinning boulders. The hunter craft pursued them relentlessly, its weapons tearing through smaller asteroids in its path. Jack cursed under his breath, his mind racing for a solution. "Wait," Lyra said suddenly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "There's a way to stop them." "I'm all ears," Jack replied, narrowly avoiding another energy bolt. "They're tracking us with a transponder," Lyra explained. "It must have been activated when I boarded your ship. If we can disable it, they'll lose us." Jack's eyes widened. "A transponder? On my ship? You're kidding me." "It's not your fault," Lyra said quickly. "They must have planted it remotely. Zalaran tech can do that." "Great," Jack muttered. "Where is it?" Lyra closed her eyes, focusing for a moment. "It's in your engine bay, near the core." Jack groaned. "Of course it is. Because that's not a dangerous place to go in the middle of a firefight. Do you have a choice? Lyra shot back. Jack exhaled sharply. Fine. Take the controls. What? Lyra's eyes widened. I can't. Just keep us from getting blown up. Jack interrupted, guiding her to the pilot's seat. You said we have to work together, right? Lyra hesitated but nodded, sliding into the seat. Her hands hovered over the controls, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jack didn't wait to see how she did. He bolted toward the engine bay, his heart pounding in his chest. The engine bay was a mess of wires and exposed panels, the result of hasty repairs during the crash. Jack scanned the area, his eyes landing on a small blinking device wedged near the core. The transponder. He grabbed a tool from his belt and reached for it, but the ship lurched violently, nearly throwing him off balance. Lyra, he yelled. A little smoother, please. Do you want us to survive or not? She shouted back. Jack gritted his teeth, focusing on the transponder. The device was embedded tightly, its edges fused to the metal. He cursed, pulling out a plasma cutter. The hunter ship's weapons pounded against their shields, and he could hear the strain in the ship's hull. Hurry, Jack. Lyra's voice came through the intercom, edged with panic. Almost there, he muttered, sparks flying as he cut through the device's casing. Finally, with a sharp tug, the transponder came free. Jack tossed it into an emergency airlock and slammed the eject button. The device shot out into space, disappearing among the asteroids. Back in the cockpit, Lyra's eyes lit up as the hunter craft suddenly veered off course, its sensors confused. She didn't waste a moment, steering the ship deeper into the asteroid field. The alien fleet hesitated, their movements erratic as they lost their lock on the ship. Jack stumbled back into the cockpit, breathing heavily. Please tell me that worked. Lyra turned to him, a small smile on her face. It worked. Jack collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, his head falling back against the wall. Good, because I'm officially out of brilliant ideas. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the tension slowly easing. But Jack knew this wasn't over. The fleet was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before they figured out another way to track them. What now? Lyra asked, her voice quiet. Jack looked at her, his expression serious. Now we figure out how to fight back. The bond of survival. The asteroid field drifted further behind, as Jack's ship glided into the cold, dark expanse of open space. The Zalaran fleet had lost their trail for now, but both Jack and Lyra knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Their hunters wouldn't give up so easily. Inside the cabin, the tension was thick. Jack sat at the console, running diagnostic checks on the ship's battered systems. The engine was running at barely 50% capacity. The shields were almost depleted, and the weapons system, what little there was of it, was offline. He let out a frustrated sigh, leaning back in his chair. This ship is held together by spit and duct tape, he muttered. One good hit, and we're toast. Lyra, sitting across from him on the cot, watched him with tired but observant eyes. She had regained some of her strength, though the ordeal of the last few hours still weighed heavily on her. She tilted her head, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. You've survived worse, she said softly, her voice carrying a note of quiet confidence. Jack glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. You don't know that. I can tell, Lyra replied, gesturing at him. You're still alive, aren't you? That says something. Jack chuckled dryly. Surviving isn't the same as winning. No, Lyra agreed, her tone growing more serious. But it's the first step. There was a pause, the hum of the ship's engines filling the silence. Jack turned his chair to face her fully, his expression softening. You've been through worse too, haven't you? Lyra looked away, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the cot. It doesn't matter. It does, Jack said firmly. You said they want you dead. Why? What's so special about you that they're willing to send an entire fleet to hunt you down? For a moment, Lyra didn't answer. Her shoulders tensed, and Jack could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Finally, she took a deep breath and met his gaze. "I wasn't supposed to exist," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm a hybrid. Half Zalaran, half something else. My people created me as part of an experiment to bridge the gap between species, to unite our kind with others. But when I started to change, they decided I was a threat." "Change how?" Jack asked, leaning forward. Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering slightly. "I don't just manipulate energy. I absorb it. From everything around me. Machines, life forms, even the environment itself. They thought they could control it, but they couldn't. And when they realized I was growing stronger, they panicked." Jack let out a low whistle. "So they created a weapon and then got scared of their own creation. Classic." "I'm not a weapon," Lyra said sharply, her voice trembling. "I didn't ask for this." Jack raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I didn't mean it like that. I'm just saying, it sounds like they're afraid of what you could do." "They are," Lyra admitted, her tone bitter. "But it's not just about me. If the rest of the galaxy found out what they did, what I am, it would destroy them. They'd lose their control, their power. That's why they want me gone." Jack leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "So, they're not just hunting you. They're covering their tracks." Lyra nodded. "Exactly." Jack let out a heavy sigh, his mind racing. He'd thought this was just about survival, about escaping the Zalarans and getting out of this alive. But now he realized the stakes were much higher. If what Lyra said was true, her existence could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. She wasn't just a target, she was a catalyst for change. "So, what do you want to do?" Jack asked, his voice quiet. Lyra looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's your plan?" Jack said, "You said you didn't ask for this, but now it's your reality. You've got a choice to make. Do you keep running, or do you fight back?" Lyra was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant. She thought about everything she had lost, her home, her people, her identity. She thought about the fear she had seen in their eyes, the betrayal that had left her stranded on that desolate planet. And she thought about Jack, the human who had risked everything to help her, even when he had no reason to. "I want to fight," she said finally, her voice steady. "But I can't do it alone." Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Good, because I wasn't planning on letting you do it alone." Lyra tilted her head, studying him. "Why? Why are you helping me?" Jack shrugged. "Maybe I'm just a sucker for lost causes. Or maybe I've seen enough of the galaxy to know that the people in charge don't always deserve to be there. You've got a chance to shake things up. I figure that's worth fighting for." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "You're a strange man, Jack." "Yeah, I've been told that before," he said with a chuckle. Before they could say more, the ship's sensors beeped softly, alerting them to a nearby celestial body. Jack turned back to the console, his brow furrowing as he studied the readings. "What is it?" Lyra asked, standing and moving to his side. "A moon," Jack said. "Small, but it's got an atmosphere and some signs of vegetation. Might be a good place to regroup, make some repairs." Lyra nodded. "And hide." "Exactly," Jack said. He steered the ship toward the moon, a sense of purpose settling over him. They still had a long way to go, and the odds were stacked against them. But for the first time, they had a plan, and they weren't going to back down. The final stand. The moon loomed large on the ship's display, its surface covered in jagged cliffs and dense forests. Patches of glowing vegetation spread across the landscape like stars fallen to the ground, giving the terrain an otherworldly beauty. Jack guided the battered ship through the atmosphere, the engines sputtering as they fought against gravity. The landing was rough, but it held together, just barely. As the engines powered down, the silence in the cabin felt almost oppressive. Jack leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. Well, we're here. Wherever here is. Lyra stood beside him, her glowing violet eyes scanning the moon's surface through the viewport. It's quiet, she said softly, her voice tinged with unease. Too quiet. Jack glanced at her. You think they'll find us here? They always find me, Lyra said, her tone somber. But if we're lucky, this place will give us some time to prepare. Jack stood, stretching his stiff muscles. Then we better make the most of it. If they're coming, we need to be ready. A plan of resistance. The two of them spent the next several hours setting up a makeshift camp near the ship. Lyra used her abilities to scan the area, ensuring there were no immediate threats, while Jack worked on repairing the ship and reinforcing its defenses. The glowing plants that covered the moon's surface emitted a faint hum of energy, which seemed to invigorate Lyra as she moved among them. Jack watched her curiously as she placed her hands on one of the larger plants, her eyes closing in concentration. The plant pulsed with light, and Jack swore he could feel the air around them grow warmer. When she opened her eyes, the weariness that had clung to her since their escape seemed to have lifted. What's that about? Jack asked, nodding toward the plant. Lyra smiled faintly. The moon is rich in energy. I can draw from it, recharge myself. It's soothing. Jack smirked. Wish I had something like that. I'm stuck with coffee and ration bars. Her smile widened slightly, but it quickly faded as she turned back toward the ship. It won't be enough, though. If they come, we need more than my powers to survive. Jack nodded, his expression grim. We need a plan. And weapons. Your ship doesn't have much in terms of armament, Lyra said, frowning. But we might be able to repurpose the energy from the moon's plants. If I can channel it through the ship's systems, it could work. Jack finished, his eyes lighting up. Turn the ship into a giant energy cannon. It's risky, Lyra warned. It could overload the ship completely. If we push it too far, it might explode. Jack shrugged. Better than sitting here waiting to get picked off. The fleet arrives. Hours later, as the two worked tirelessly on their plan, the ship's sensors lit up with a warning. Jack's stomach sank as he stared at the display. The Zalaran fleet had found them. Multiple ships were entering the moon's atmosphere, their sleek designs cutting through the sky like knives. They're here, Lyra said, her voice calm but steely. She stood beside Jack, her eyes glowing brightly. How long do we have? Not long, Jack replied, his fingers flying across the console. They'll pinpoint our location in minutes. Lyra nodded. Then we'll meet them on our terms. Jack turned to her, a question in his eyes. You sure about this? There's no going back if we fight. I've been running my whole life, Lyra said, her tone resolute. It's time to stop. Jack gave her a small, determined grin. All right then, let's give them hell. The battle begins. As the first Zalaran ships descended, the moon's surface erupted in flashes of light and sound. Lyra stood outside the ship, her hands raised as she summoned energy from the glowing plants around her. Bolts of light shot from her fingers, striking the enemy ships and forcing them to swerve. Jack manned the ship's controls, directing bursts of energy from the improvised cannon they had rigged together. The first wave of enemy fighters was caught off guard by their resistance. Two ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light, their wreckage scattering across the moon. But more were coming, larger, more heavily armed vessels that hovered ominously above the treetops. They're deploying ground troops, Jack yelled over the comms. Lyra didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her body glowing as she channeled the moon's energy into herself. When the troops emerged from their ships, armed with advanced weapons, Lyra unleashed a wave of energy that sent them sprawling. The ground shook, the glowing plants around her reacting to her power as if they were alive. But the effort was taking its toll. Sweat beaded on Lyra's forehead, and her movements grew slower, her breaths more labored. Lyra, fall back, Jack shouted, his voice desperate. You're overdoing it. I can handle it, she replied, though her voice wavered. The turning point. As the battle raged on, a massive Zalaran mothership descended, its shadow engulfing the battlefield. Jack stared at it in horror. They brought the big guns. Lyra's eyes narrowed. That's their flagship. Their commander is aboard. Jack's mind raced. If we take that out, the rest of them might retreat. Lyra nodded, her jaw set. I'll need time to gather enough energy for a direct strike. Jack gritted his teeth. Then I'll buy you that time. He bolted into the ship, firing up the engines and launching the vessel into the air. The ship's improvised cannon fired wildly, drawing the enemy's attention. Jack's piloting skills were put to the test as he dodged enemy fire, keeping their focus on him and away from Lyra. On the ground, Lyra knelt among the glowing plants, her body trembling as she absorbed their energy. The air around her crackled with power, the light from her eyes so bright it was almost blinding. When she rose, her entire body radiated like a star. The final strike. Lyra raised her hands, and a beam of pure energy shot from her palms, striking the mothership's shields. The massive vessel shuddered under the impact, its weapons turning toward her. Jack saw the danger and pushed his ship into the line of fire, taking the brunt of the attack. The shields failed, and the cockpit filled with smoke, but Jack held on. "You've got this, Lyra," he muttered. "Finish it." With a final deafening roar, Lyra unleashed the full force of her power. The mothership's shields collapsed, and the beam pierced through its core. The massive vessel erupted in a blinding explosion, the shockwave rattling the moon's surface. As the remaining Zalaran ships retreated, Jack's damaged vessel crash-landed near the glowing plants. Lyra stumbled toward the wreckage, her body weak but alive. She found Jack slumped in the cockpit, bruised but grinning. "Told you it was a great plan," he said weakly. Lyra smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're impossible." Jack chuckled. "Yeah, but we won." As they looked out at the stars above, now free of the Zalaran fleet, they both knew this wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning.